Okay, welcome everyone to this webinar. Thanks to those in the Caribbean, Latin America for your early starts, and those of you in Asia for staying up a little late. My name is Will McFarland. I'm pleased to be the host today. I will chair, introduce the speakers, host the great group of panelists that we've got lined up for you today. I actually live in Vietnam, although I'm in the UK at the moment. I work for SMV as a global technical expert on climate and business. We're a Dutch headquartered but global and decentralized NGO with offices in about 25 countries across West, East, Southern Africa, Southeast Asia primarily. Personally, I work across SMV's portfolio of projects related to climate change. And one of our key approaches as an organization is private sector development and market-based approaches and creating an enabling environment for businesses to thrive and contribute to sustainable development. So I'm really grateful to have been brought into this project by the ICR Facility team for this particular kind of mini-series and projects we've run on private sector and adaptation. SMV is one of the 4 implementing agencies for the ICR Facility, that's the Investment Climate Reform Facility, which is hosting this online event today. The ICR Facility is a program which is co-funded by the European Union, co-funded by the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States, OACPS, under the 11th European Development Fund, together with the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BNZ, and the British Council. And there are 4 implementing partners: GIZ, British Council, Expertise France, and SMV. Before I continue, I quickly want to mention something now in case, for whatever reason, people have to leave early. The foundation of the ICR Facility really is a technical assistance facility, and we strongly welcome eligible applicants to apply for technical assistance from the one-on-one support facility and technical assistance funds on the issues that we will be discussing today. And really today's event is trying to inspire and kind of create some initial ideas of how of potential ideas that could be taken forwards by, in collaboration with the technical assistance facility, if that's of interest to your government, your country, your institution, your private sector organization, etc. So please see the slides later and in your follow-up emails. You can check out the LinkedIn page, look for Investment Climate Reform Facility. Also on our website there's more information, and my colleague Sok, perhaps you can please put the website link in the chat function in the GoToWebinar platform. And we will cover the technical assistance facility again briefly at the end and in the agenda. So there's more opportunities to understand about it and kind of see if it's of interest to you. And then lastly, on the kind of pleasantries, I just want to make a note that this event is being recorded and actually gets watched quite a lot of times by kind of colleagues and kind of the network around ACP countries and beyond, which is really great. If for whatever reason you don't want to be recorded, please just keep your microphones off, or of course you can leave, but I really encourage you not to do that. So anyway, it's being recorded. So before I get into the agenda and introduce our kind of speakers and contributors today, I want to give a little background to this series. Thanks, Sok. So this has been a kind of mini series of reports and webinars and also some blogs. The ICR Facility as a whole is kind of oriented around sustainable development in general, but we know for many of the ACP countries, climate change is the most or one of the most significant challenges to achieving sustainable development. Also, the ACP countries need to stimulate private investment for climate change adaptation. Every country really needs to do that, and Charlene will cover it more in her presentation. But improving the ease of doing business is key to unlocking private sector development in general, and the contribution of the private sector to sustainable development. And that certainly applies to climate change and climate change adaptation, which is why we wanted to kind kind of build this series of knowledge sharing and building connections between professionals on specifically around climate adaptation, investment, and the private sector. Next, please, stop. So this is a table actually that's in the first report that we produced on this series. It's some examples of activities that might kind of constitute investment climate reform or business environment reform. For those of you perhaps for whom this is not the background, such as myself. Next, please, Sok. And as someone working in kind of climate change and business, I felt, and kind of it was agreed amongst the ICR Facility team, that quite a lot of these related to issues of fiscal policy and financial policy, such as kind of improved and transparent public financial management, domestic revenue mobilisation, tax policy and administration, investment policies, access to financial markets. So a lot of kind of parts of the thread related to fiscal and financial policy. And this was also something we knew from the climate debates and negotiations and partnerships, and the momentum behind all of that in these years. Obviously, we were supposed to have the UNFCCC COP in Glasgow end of last year, and will now be November, December 2021. So it's great timing, we felt, to have a series on this and share some knowledge and try and kind of build a way and build some inspiration, build some connections, and to kind of show that the ICR facility was available to support ACP countries on progressing these topics, if that was of interest to them. Next, please, Sok. So you can find the work to date on the website under Knowledge Hub. Climate smart investment has been one of the key themes that the facility has been producing work on over the last 12-18 months. You can see some of the other topics up there on the screen: COVID-19 recovery, innovative finance, fragility. Lots of great stuff on there across different topics. We've produced some series of papers. The first one's published, the second one's nearly published. Some blogs. You can see the recordings from previous webinars we ran as well, and the URL. The URL is up there on the screen now, and of course, Google or any other search engine will find it for you. Yeah, so the aim of what we're doing today is to try and kind of inspire people, maybe suggest some policies or initiatives or institutions that might be relevant to your context and your country. We certainly don't have fixed solutions for your context, but I think we've got some really great speakers, 3 from ACP country governments, interestingly all based in the Ministry of Finance, which I think is super interesting. Yes, so this is the agenda for the rest of the day. We'll have an introduction from Escipión, who's the Undersecretary General in charge of the Structural Economic Transformation and Trade Department from the Office of the ACP Secretariat. Then Charlene Watson, who is Charlene's an independent consultant specializing in research and strategy around sources and instruments of climate finance at the national and international level. Charlene's been collaborating with myself and others in the ICR facility team on this mini project, and she will give a presentation on this topic on fiscal and financial policy. And then we've got this really great panel, which I will be doing kind of questions and discussion with. Nadia Spencer-Henry, who's Debt Manager in the Ministry of Finance and Corporate Governance in Antigua and Barbuda. Benedict Lebanda, who is Chief Executive Office of the Environmental Investment Fund of Namibia. Thierry Kalisa, Senior Economist, Head of Macroeconomic Policy Division in the Ministry of Finance in Rwanda. And Roger Callow, who's a water specialist and research associate at ODI, which is an independent think tank and research institution in in London. Okay, so before I move on to the speakers, one more point. In your kind of GoToWebinar software, there's a chat function, and if you have any questions for panelists specifically, or generally, or want to talk and share information with each other, I really encourage you to use that chat function, and we will come at the end to kind of questions from the audience. Great, so that's me done, and without further ado, I'd like to welcome Escipión from the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States for some introductory remarks on this topic. Please welcome Escipión. Great to connect again.
Thank you, Will. For me, it's a big honor to open this seminar today in collaboration with our partners that were mentioned by William. We have a very good panel today. I just wanted to detail that this specific panel and the Investment Climate Reform Facility in general is part of the overall OACPS European Union Private Sector Development Strategy that seeks to achieve 4 major goals. The first one is to improve the business climate of our countries. The other one is to strengthen our intermediary organizations, especially those treating with small and medium-sized enterprises, support the informal sector to join the formal economy, and improve the access to finance by our countries, our private sector, among others, through blending facilities. This strategy, which was developed jointly, is based on many things, which is the sharing of best practices, what we're doing today, ensuring market access to our products, promoting the entrepreneurship of youth and women, and public-private sector dialogue at all levels, which is part of the exercise today. I believe that the theme of today is of the utmost importance about how we can improve domestic financial and fiscal policy to help the private sector. Most of our countries do not necessarily lack of liquidity, but they do lack of investment funds, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises, and especially those working in long-term projects such as agriculture, which requires special needs, more time to repay, and in some cases grace periods. So we are really looking forward to the interaction today and see how we can ensure that our private sector has a necessary financial resources to be able to promote their ventures. So thank you very much for listening here today. We are led by His Excellency, Mr. George Revelo Pinto Chicote from Angola. He's a Secretary General of the OACPS, and the Secretariat in Brussels is at your service. We work very closely with the ICR, so we're very happy for this seminar today. And please ask questions, send us comments, and we're at your disposal. Thank you very much, William. And I just wanted to congratulate Stephanie Kahn, which is the ICR team leader, and all her team. So wishing you a very good debate and good afternoon.
Thanks, Escipión. Thank you very much. I was expecting one more slide, perhaps. Maybe it's somewhere else. But quickly, just kind of referring back to one of the ways which OACPS and the EU are available to support eligible countries, but also other kind of non-governmental institutions, is through this ICR facility. And the goal of the facility is to contribute to exactly this cooperation framework that Escipión mentioned. It provides technical assistance at 3 levels, supporting the enhancement of the business environment, supporting policies and reforms to make the business environment more socially and environmentally sustainable, and also supporting public-private dialogue processes. And certainly webinars and online events such as this is one part of that. But if that's something that's relevant to you within your country, then please get in touch and take Escipión and the team up on this offer to be at your service and contribute to your sustainable development goals and objectives. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce Charlene. Charlene and I used to work together over 5 years ago, and it's been great to connect again and collaborate on this project. Charlene has a wealth of experience in climate finance, from sourcing it and also spending it at national and multilateral and international levels, also working to make finance flows more broadly, such as domestic budget, private investment to become more consistent with climate and SDG objectives. Charlene is part of the technical team on the UNFCCC Standing Committee on Finance's Biennial Assessment and Overview of Climate Finance Flows. She's an author on the UN's Adaptation Gap Report. She wrote the chapter on finance. Charlene is also co-chair of the Finance Working Group of the Independent Global Stocktake, which is an initiative working to support the UNFCCC's kind of stocktake of progress towards the Paris Agreement. So she's a wealth of experience in this area. And yes, Charlene, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Will. That's very kind. But I have to admit, I'm really here today to learn from all of you as well, and especially our panel, who I'm sure will have some really incredible things to say about on-the-ground experience. So I'm just going to do a very short presentation today, and we'll get straight into using financial policy and regulation and fiscal policies in a way that we can support adaptation efforts in ACP countries. So on the next slide, please. It's very clear that more investment in and finance for adaptation is going to be needed. So ACP countries are some of the most climate vulnerable in the world. So the Global Climate Risk Index that measures and ranks countries based on the impact of the climate-related extreme weather events in the last 20 years puts 16 there are 16 ACP countries in the top 20 most affected countries when they're ranked by GDP-adjusted economic losses. It's also important to note that over the past decade, adaptation finance flows have increased, and this is seen mostly in public concessional finance flows to adaptation, where climate change has rapidly risen on the agenda. However, these flows remained well below the articulated needs of countries. The graphic on the slide shows the sectors in which ACP countries have identified the need for climate action and specifically the need for adaptation. And it's worth noting that some of the key sectors here are agriculture, water, and disaster risk management. So the need to mobilize private finance towards climate action is globally recognized. And when we talk about private actors, we know that they're very diverse, and we include in this categorization everything from individuals, households, through to micro, small, medium enterprises, corporations, and ultimately commercial banks and other private finance institutions. So with the understanding that we need to mobilize private actors towards adaptation actions, the ICR Facility, as Will has already introduced, has embarked on a series of papers that focuses on mobilizing this private investment towards adaptation. So the first paper that's available on the website thinks about proactively mobilizing the private sector towards different adaptation actions. It describes the potential business cases and also the barriers that prevent such investment already occurring. The second paper, that as Will has mentioned, is nearly ready and hopefully will be over summer, explores much more the roles and the solutions that international concessional finance can provide in stimulating private adaptation investment in ACP countries, including blended finance, for example. And the third paper that we're here to talk about today will be much more about the role of domestic government policy that can stimulate adaptation finance and investment. On the next slide, I just wanted to dwell for a second on the fact that international finance is critical. So developed countries have committed to support developing countries under the UNFCCC, and part of this is the 100 billion a year goal to mobilize collectively from public and private sources. Actually what counts to the 100 billion is open to political interpretation. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of agreement about what counts. What is clear is that this is a political goal and it needs to be met to maintain the trust and the faith in the UNFCCC system. The figure shows that the goal of this provision, the 100 billion for adaptation and mitigation, is well below the estimated needs of adaptation finance, which is the green kind of dotted line, taking into account variable estimates. So really what we need from this international climate finance is to unlock greater flows of capital in the most effective and efficient ways that it can. So paper 2 in this series does go into this a little bit more. It highlights there's a need to support countries to translate their national adaptation plans and priorities into investment priorities and ultimately into potential investment cases. On the next slide, please. Back to domestic policy to mobilize finance. So governments have at their disposal a number of policy levers that can influence the complex system of finance flows. So these levers can directly or indirectly change the allocation and the impact of finance. And they can ultimately work together to shift private finance. And private finance in turn can go back to influence policy and regulatory choices. So on this slide, we have 4 categories of government levers. The first is financial policy and regulation, which primarily influence behavior through the force of law. The second is fiscal policy levers, where we're mostly talking about adjustments to price that consumers face. There's public finance that we talks much more about shifting the risk. And finally, information influence that really influence behaviors through awareness. What's useful about talking about these suite of government levers is that they're not new. They're not innovative. They're not innovative in the sense that we're designing them from scratch. So really the discussion is, and I'm looking forward to the discussion today, about how can we better use these tools in the face of a changing climate. So on the next slide, today we're talking specifically about fiscal policy and financial policy and regulation. Taxes and subsidies are perhaps the most commonly and easily understood fiscal policy tool. So as we've seen on the previous slide, we're influencing private actors mostly through price changes. But we also put in this category direct spending, such as on research and development, public procurement, and also public infrastructure, for example. And these policies are often implemented through sectoral ministries and other public authorities. So already in the climate space, there's much debate about the reform of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. To put renewable energy on a level playing field. There's much debate about carbon pricing and how it can incentivize less emission intensive technologies and products. Fewer discussions, however, are being had about how fiscal policy can be used for adaptation or to build resilience to climate change impacts. For financial policy and regulation, what we refer to today is the regulation, supervision and oversight of financial payment systems, and this includes markets and institutions. And these are largely driven by Ministry of Finance, as well as central banks and other financial regulatory authorities. Much of this financial policy and regulation, as reflected in the mandates of the institutions that employ them, are focused on promoting financial stability, in addition to improving market efficiency, increasing credit access, and protecting investors. So I just wanted to take a little bit of time to kind of explain why are these tools being pulled out today and why might these be important. So in recent years, we've really seen a rapid rise in the integration of climate in debates around real economy spending in the financial sector. And this is largely a result of a growing understanding in the actual and the potential physical adverse impacts of climate change and the associated direct and indirect losses and damages. And climate change can also lead to transition risks that capture the shifts in asset values or higher costs of engaging in businesses that might be faced as a result of policy changes towards more low emission, climate resilient economies. So the adverse effects of climate change in the real economy through industry, corporations, enterprises and consumers then have implications for the financial system. So for example, it could change profitability. It could change the particular market and sector engagements of a country or a company. It can change operating costs. There could be increased default risks for loan portfolios, and even damage to assets that might serve as collateral, that are creating losses that may cause banks to restrict lending in certain areas. And at the same time, any losses will weaken household wealth and in turn reduce consumption. And this illustrates that climate risks are by and large not yet adequately reflected in balance sheets and asset prices. But it also shows how these can cascade through the real economy, through the financial sector, giving us a strong justification for why we need to see how these tools can be put to work. So on the next slide, I wanted to talk specifically about fiscal policy. And the way we're trying to articulate this is in 3 different buckets and 3 different ways in which we think it might be worth to start talking about how we can use fiscal policy to support adaptation. The first is around directly encouraging adaptation actions and behaviors through subsidies. So this might be easier to explain through examples, but in agricultural support, direct transfers are made to producers through, for example, production payments. It might also include conservation payments, where farmers are rewarded for less environmentally harmful or more sustainable actions. And production support might also be made conditional, for example, on particular measures that are being undertaken, such as soil conservation. We can also use exemptions from tax obligations. So these exempt either a sector or an activity from those tax obligations and might be considered a foregone revenue or an indirect subsidy. And exemptions have been used in the past on inputs, maybe perhaps fertilizers or outputs in terms of changing value-added tax. Farmers who practice soil conservation might be eligible for reductions in annual property taxes, for example. So all ways to try and encourage adaptation actions. The second bucket we've identified here would be direct public spending. And this captures the provision of public goods, perhaps it's research and advisory services, public infrastructure, food and safety standards. Advisory service, for example, might work towards providing more weather information or early warning systems should there be extreme weather events. Research and development might work to improve yields, and drought resistance, or reduce transportation losses. And the development of public infrastructure is to certainly take into account these climate risks, whether they're transitional or physical. Public procurement refers to the purchase of government and state-owned enterprises of goods and services. Public authorities are major consumers of goods and services in construction, in catering, in vehicles, and in transport. So these can be required, the rules and regulations can be put in place for them to require the procurement of green over other types of goods and services. And finally, it's worth noting that social protection schemes have also been found to build resilience to climate change, and as a result can be specifically built in order to do so. For example, they might have some provisions that provide support and liquidity immediately before or after weather shocks. And finally, the third bucket is fiscal resilience. So fiscal policy for resilience is likely to include the better integration of climate risk into planning and budgetary cycles. So this might include contingency planning, as government finances and a country's debt sustainability are exposed to fiscal risks from climate-related weather events, particularly for spending on climate-related relief and recovery. It might also include consideration of any necessary bailouts for public and private corporations, including state-owned enterprises, as a result of these events that might be considered as contingent liabilities. So in this context, the fiscal tools available to increase liquidity and reduce the risk of debt default might include contingency and reserve funds, ex-ante contingent credit, ex-post borrowing, risk transfer and pooling. There has been an emergence of many multi-country sovereign disaster risk insurance pools, might also include insurance of public assets. On the next slide, it's worth also noting that fiscal policy introduction and adjustment is not going to be easy. A lot of fiscal policy is already being put in place for other development, social and economic objectives. So we need to be very mindful about shifting policies and also the competing objectives for a particular country that fiscal policy is being used for. It's true that there can also be opposition from certain interest groups, as we see when we're trying to design fiscal policy for climate change mitigation. It may also be that there are a large informal sector in a particular country, and this might fall outside of any revenue raising or subsidy schemes, making them more challenging to implement. And finally, COVID-19 has really underscored the importance of public debt management and exacerbated strains on debt servicing, which will also potentially narrow the scope for fiscal policies for adaptation right now. Yet, we know that countries are at work to implement the nationally determined contributions and their adaptation priorities identified in their national adaptation plans. So we do need to have these detailed discussions about the pathways for these adaptations objectives, how they might be achieved through policy, what are they going to cost, and how they are going to be financed, including if there is a role for domestic finance in these fiscal policies for adaptation. Moving on to the next slide for financial policy and regulation, just to re-emphasize, the focus here is not on wider climate-related policies and regulations, but of course it's recognized these do impact investment decisions. Specifically, what we're talking about here are the policies and regulations that influence the financial sector, implying the policies and regulations that shift and mobilize finance towards climate resilient development, and thereby influencing asset owners, asset managers, banks and corporations. And again, we've tried to bucket these a little bit for ease into three groupings that we think are important. The first is around financial strategies, governance and guidance. So the creation of a green finance strategy, which might also be called a roadmap or an action plan, and the related institutions and expert groups that come along with those indicate a high level of political will and awareness of the climate change, environmental issues and impacts, and the need for aligning prudential and climate-related objectives in the national financing architecture. Sustainable and green finance taxonomies have been quite popular recently, and these are tools that help investors understand if an activity is environmentally sustainable or potentially consistent with climate objectives. And the EU is a strong example of a process that has emerged around the EU taxonomy. This clarity on what might be considered green or what might be considered sustainable, and those identification of the activities within that, can really work to increase investor confidence. They can work to prevent greenwashing, so we really know what's green. And it also works to facilitate market development by increasing the demand and also the visibility of these particular activities in the market. The second bucket around enhanced supervisory review, this requires financial reporting to include information on climate risks. And where there is more transparency on the physical and the transitional risks to which specific financial institutions are exposed, we can shift capital allocation away from either carbon intensive assets that have or those that are potentially maladaptive and those that are not going to build resilience and may well make people less resilient to climate change. And the third bucket is the adjustment of capital and liquidity requirements. So liquidity requirements ensure that financial institutions have enough assets available should markets shift and not too much tied up in particular types of assets. So potentially lowering the liquidity requirements for green sectors might encourage green finance by reducing the amount that financial institutions have to hold against this particular lending. We can also make use of lending limits, credit caps on floors that can, again, limit exposure to a certain type of asset or set targets for flows towards those that might be green or more able to build resilience. It is worth noting that this last bucket of tools is very nascent in their application, and many remain to be kind of tested for their effectiveness. And of course, a lot of these measures are going to be highly dependent on the country context and the mandate of the institutions in country that will be putting them in place. On my final slide, I just wanted to reiterate that the Paris Agreement, in one of its third long-term goals, the first being on mitigation, the second on adaptation, the third long-term goal of the Paris Agreement is making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emission and climate resilient development. So this article emphasizes that financing climate action is much more than money into good or money away from bad, but it requires deep change in order to deliver the kind of the future that we want in the way that capital is allocated and accounted for in the financial system too. And so actors really need these clear signals from policymakers for future direction. And in the green box, I've just put down a number of 3 coalitions that form part of a number of coalitions that are starting to emerge around these topics and hopefully starting to explore them in more detail. The Coalition of Finance Ministers for Action is the secretariat at the World Bank, and at the moment there's over 50 countries in that coalition leading the global climate response. The network of central banks and supervisors for greening the financial system have over 92 members and 42 observers now. And finally, the OECD Collaborative on Green Budgeting is looking to design new tools to access and drive improvements in the alignment of national expenditure and revenue processes with climate goals. So I look forward to the panel, and I look forward to hearing more kind of examples, challenges, and ideas about how we can start using fiscal policy much more for resilience. But thank you very much. Back to you, Will.
Super. Thank you so much, Charlene. Loads of kind of examples and content in there. And I like how you kind of link to this need to kind of balance adaptation objectives with other societal, social objectives, especially given perhaps potentially limited fiscal space at the moment. And actually, I think all the speakers that we have today really kind of come at climate adaptation in a kind of quite broad way, thinking about kind of societal and economic and social resilience as a whole, and adaptation as one of the climate adaptation, climate extremes, climate events as one of the stresses on that. So I think that's something that will kind of certainly come through from the great panel that we have here today. Nadia, I will let you kind of find the unmute button and your video button as I introduce you. And I just want to remind also those in the audience, please do kind of send in questions and kind of points of comment and things that you would like to introduce to the discussion via the chat box in your dialogue. Great. So Thanks so much, Nadia, for sparing some time with us today. Nadia is an accomplished professional with over 18 years experience in fiscal and debt management. She's worked with the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank and the Financial Services Regulatory Commission of Antigua and Barbuda. And Nadia is currently debt manager in the Ministry of Finance of Antigua Barbuda, where she's been in that role for the last 10 years. In her spare time, Nadia is also a doctoral candidate with the University of West Indies Cave-Hill campus, and her research interest is in climate finance. And I know immediately before and immediately after this webinar, Nadia is going back into kind of GCF and UNFCCC meetings and negotiations and that kind of stuff. So Nadia, great to have you with us here today, this morning where you are. Can you start by telling us a little bit about the learning journey that Antigua and Barbuda is going on with respect to the need to integrate climate change into your operations at the Ministry of Finance?
Hi, good morning. Well, it's a pleasure for me to be on this forum today and just to talk a little bit about what Antigua and Barbuda has been learning and is continuing to learn every day. I hope my audio is pretty clear. It's sounding good to me. Can you hear me well, Will? Great. So our country is a small island developing states. We have 2 islands, Antigua and Barbuda, and we're one of the most highly indebted countries in the world. Because of this, it has created what I call the trifecta of needing to do things. You're highly indebted, you're small, and thirdly, we're open to lots and lots of climate-related shocks to our economy. So over the years, Antigua and Barbuda has had to learn how to best adapt in this situation. We prepare for climate events every year. We have a running hurricane season between June to November every year, and we prepare for this rather assiduously physically. But what has also become clear to us as a Ministry of Finance is that we have to prepare financially for it. And this has been part of the main part of our learning journey. The Ministry of Finance tends to be an overarching regulatory body, but we've learned that we cannot do it alone. So we've had to integrate with other ministries, our ministries of agriculture and our ministries of environment who tend to feel these pressures as they tackle it more frontally. But we've had to help them to prepare financially for all types of catastrophic events. In Antigua's case, we're open to invasive species, to droughts, and hurricanes, which we are almost due one almost every year. And more recently, in 2017, we had one of our islands almost totally incapacitated from a hurricane, and this has left us still rebuilding from that process. What that has meant is it's opened us to all kinds of fiscal risks, debt risk, because our debt keeps climbing when our economy takes this type of hit. And of course, we have to finance most of this repair work through debt. So it has been critical for us to focus on integrating appropriate adaptation policies as part of our fiscal planning.
Thanks, Nadia. Yes, sounds difficult balancing act between this, between the kind of needs on this fiscal policy space, as Charlene put it, and the kind of existing limitations kind of placed by the existing kind of debt burden on the country. Can you tell us in a bit more detail about some of the existing fiscal policies that you use for climate adaptation in Antigua and Barbuda?
Yeah, so going more specifically to what we've used as policies, we've had to incorporate this type of planning into our medium-term development planning. And more recently, Antigua and Barbuda has engaged a climate finance specialist working along with the World Bank to be able to do this even better. But even before we did so, we did have policies with respect to tax exemptions that we provided for hurricane shutters, renewable energy type activities. So for example, if you wanted to buy things like solar panels, backup generators that are diesel, or things that help you to adapt, you literally had to apply for tax exemptions, and they were provided. Now we've known that we have to shift it and take the diesel out of it and stay purely green with that tax exemption. So we've had to try to now relook that policy. We also have an environment levy that's charged at the port, and this is charged on things that generate fossil fuels mainly, so vehicles and that type of stuff. We also have a bottle and can levy, which is meant to deal with the waste management for bottles and cans. Also on the side of fiscal policy, we have a national development fund that's funded through a citizenship by investment program, and a portion of this fund is allocated to waste management and waste collection. So those have been our policies that we've actively been implementing and following. But I'll talk to you a bit more about the other things that we have coming on stream.
Thanks, Nadia. Yes, so what's speaking of coming on stream, what's next for you with respect to fiscal policy for adaptation and building resilience more broadly, and maybe touch on some of the challenges to implementing these that you face?
So one of the challenges that we've faced is that we've not been able to monitor things as we would like. We're not able to see how the policies that we have been implemented is affecting adaptation. And in order to monitor the spending and the revenues received, we have now put in place a chart of accounts, a specialized area in our chart of accounts, so that we can do better budget management and monitoring to be able to see how our spending is impacting. We're working a lot more closely as well now with our catastrophic risk insurance facility to better understand our risk, so that we are able to look at the policy or parametric insurance policy and to make sure that it's giving us adequate coverage. Previously, we used to only apply for excessive storm damage, but now we are also looking at excessive rainfall as well as an earthquake policy. We recently put those policies in place. Another thing we've done recently is to start to look at our procurement practices and to make sure that we are practicing sustainable procurement, so that we do not end up with stranded assets and thus leading to issues with our circular economy and our waste management generally. We're also introducing what's called a tourism accommodation levy, which is to assign this revenue stream to now set up a new fund known as a climate resilience and development fund. And this fund, we are hoping, will be there to help to buffer our financing for disasters as well as our adaptation. And this is meant to, of course, support what we're doing on the National Development Fund side, as well as to support any receipts that we have from the Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility. And finally, of course, we are also trying to do a debt for climate swap. It's been a long time coming. It's been an uphill journey for us thus far, but it is something that we are hoping to achieve in the upcoming years.
So what are some of the challenges you face when trying to shift these fiscal policies? What makes things uphill struggles? And do they differ at all by sector? Was something else that I wanted to ask.
Of course, we do face quite a lot of resistance, particularly from the energy sector. Because, for example, now that we're thinking of not subsidizing things like generators, and we've been looking at our subsidies that we had been providing for fossil fuel type activities and removing those subsidies. So what that has meant is that it has shifted persons' consumption patterns. We have a lot more persons moving towards solar panel or even generating wind energy, as opposed to using traditional fossil fuel generated energy. And this has meant that we've had quite a lot of pushback from that sector. We've even had internal struggles from our end, because we do have a public arm that generates electricity. So you could see how that could be a bit of a clash if we have persons shifting their consumption patterns towards renewable energy, and we have an arm that's trying to generate energy through fossil fuels, how that could be a bit of a challenge. We've also had some pushback from the tourism sector, particularly with this new possibility of an introduction of a tourism accommodation levy, because for them, they see that as an additional tax to the sector. And when the sector is so vulnerable because of things like COVID, etc. But we see this as the sector contributing to adaptation and contributing to the nature that the tourists enjoy. But these inherent policy views and how people see the implementation of the policy has been a clash, ongoing clash for us.
Thanks, Nadia. Super interesting. And on that last point, certainly one of the themes and kind of, I guess, mechanisms promoted by the EU ACP kind of cooperation is public-private dialogue, and perhaps some good ongoing dialogue is required between yourselves and the tourism industry and the energy industry to overcome some of these challenges. Yeah, thank you so much, and I'm sure we will come back to you a little later. I'm also sure for our audience that we will see kind of some case studies from Antigua and Barbuda in the reports, because I know Charlene knows yourself and other colleagues and the context in Antigua and Barbuda quite well, and you've got some really interesting kind of existing and ongoing developments in this space. So thank you so much for joining and contributing today. Next, I'd like to invite Thierry Calissa. Thierry is Senior Economist and Head of the Macroeconomic Policy Directorate General in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning in the government of Rwanda. His work covers the areas of economic research, macroeconomic analysis, and tax policy. He graduated from University Lyon 2, France, with a PhD in economics, and has also previously been a teacher in economics also. Thierry, thank you so much for joining us today, and perhaps you can start and introduce to everyone a little bit about your ministry's role, particularly in Rwanda's economic recovery strategy from COVID-19. That's something that's also a key theme for the ICR facility, the recovery from COVID-19, and the elements of fiscal policy within it that might support climate adaptation and climate resilience.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. As you said, I'm working in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning. Basically, our role, and especially our team, we're part of the Office of the Chief Economist. We are responsible to design and propose new macroeconomic policies and advise the Minister on tax policy issues. Since last year, 2020, especially March 2020, that's our first case of COVID-19. So far, country has been affected, as all countries in the world. We have more than 30,000 cases and close to 400 deaths. The economy has been affected also a lot with negative growth last year, 2020, of minus 3.4%, which we have never seen in the country. To recover well, the country has put in place an economic recovery plan with a focus to contain the pandemic and mitigate the impact of COVID-19, especially on households' income, support businesses and protect jobs, and the objective of bringing back the economy to its pre-COVID growth level by 2022. So, given the urgency of the situation, you agree with me that it's important to focus on the short term, but what we are also looking at in this recovery is to keep in mind the long term while dealing with the recovery phase. For example, we have been talking and discussing a lot the UN level, and the Rwanda is also part of different groups discussing building back better. We as Rwanda believe that they need to promote green growth and scale up green investment through innovative financial instruments. and protection of the environment and natural resources is part of our national strategy for transformation, which is running until 2024. As you said, fiscal policy can be used to achieve these objectives, even if there are limitations to that, especially in the context of a low-income country. We can come back to that later. If I can mention a bit the fiscal policy that we are using on the tax side, what is currently in place is some of it more recently, in the past few months, started. We have started to put in place some tax incentives to encourage e-mobility uptake. This is by waiving import duty and excise, plus also putting zero rating VAT or exempting VAT for electric vehicles, and spare parts and batteries and charging station equipment, everything related to electric vehicles. We have also several taxes and levies already on fuel, which are paid by the consumer. So we have an excise duty, we have infrastructure development levy, which is specific levy. We have a strategic reserves levy, a fuel levy, Canadian levy. So there are plenty of taxes on fuel already. We have VAT exemption on energy supply equipment, especially those that promote energy efficiency and clean energy. We have a corporate income tax preferential rate of 15% as opposed to 30%, which is the normal rate for registered investors in the field of renewable energy generation, because transmission and distribution, because that's the priority sector for the government. And there's also possibility of corporate income tax holiday for large energy generation projects, attracting more than $50 million investment. This is part of our investment code. On the spending side, because when you talk about fiscal policy, as Charlene was saying, there's tax policy, and that's also on the spending side. Despite our limited means, we make sure that the Ministry of Agriculture and local governments has enough means to mobilize the communities to cultivate all the irrigation sites. We also provide improved seeds at affordable prices and support post-harvest handling. All this with the objective of being less subject to weather conditions when it comes to agricultural production. Finally, if I can also mention disaster management, this is going to be a bigger part of every country's budget in the coming years. In the past 5 years, we recorded different disasters, floods, droughts, more recently volcanic eruption. So all this we know is things that are coming. We've experienced now from these past events, and working with our ministry in charge of disaster management, we are trying to improve in this area. We also publish a fiscal risk statement every year, of which we assess risks related specifically to natural disasters.
Thanks, Jackie. Yeah, a lot going on there, and interesting to hear these kind of two sides, both around your fiscal policy with regards raising finance, or supporting things through kind of like reduced taxes, corporate income tax, or import duties, etc. But also how you're spending the money, also on kind of specific sectors and areas of need. Can you talk a little bit more around kind of social protection in Rwanda, and how kind of, in your vision, this also helps build resilience to climate change impact, and how you support social, how you can provide social protection through fiscal policy also?
Yes, we have various social protection programs that have been scaled up, especially since the COVID-19, because one of the focus of government was to ensure that people are protected during this period. But if I can maybe focus a bit on those that are related to agriculture, because in our context, the majority of the poorest population depends on the agriculture sector. And this also is an indirect way to spend on climate change adaptation too. So specifically, as part of our economic recovery plan, we are trying to scale up some of the interventions that are already there. In that case, can mention increasing the availability and access and use of inputs, which are all inputs for the agriculture sector. We have also sufficient quantities of improved seeds, especially here we talk about maize, wheat, and soybean seeds, to be available and affordable for farmers. Farmers of the poorest category, and that's really directly social protection. We have a way to classify people by category of income, which is called Ubude, and those farmers of the poorest category are provided with seeds for free, so that they also improve their food security situation. So Rwanda Agriculture Board, which is an agency by the government, is also supported to continue producing early generation seeds. We support local seed producers to acquire seed post-harvest handling, process and storage facilities to guarantee the quality of seeds. We also try to ensure that everything related to use of fertilizers and distribution of inputs to the farmers is made on time, and support some small-scale irrigation, encourage the youth to be part of small-scale irrigation service providers. So all this is in line with maintaining adequate quantities of food. Directly, there are other also social protection programs that we call Vision 2020 Murenge program. These were mainly in two things. We talk about direct cash transfer and support to vulnerable groups through public works. So, for example, if there is a road to be constructed, then there's priority to employ the poorest categories of people who can work, those who can work, and this is part of the local social security program.
Great, thanks, Thierry. Yeah, just one more quick one. I wanted to hear a bit more about your kind of your support to small-scale irrigation program. Yeah, if you could maybe on that, I thought that sounded very interesting.
Oh, the one I was mentioning is mainly the really small-scale irrigation program, but within in our budget there's also a big part that is investment towards big-scale irrigation program that the government is doing. So there's what the government is directly supervising, or directly, you know, from the budget is directly supervising, and there's also what the government is doing at the local level to encourage, especially in the rural areas, unemployed youth to go into this activity of small-scale irrigation and provide services to farmers. So, so it's in two aspects: the bigger scale one and the smaller scale one. We know that for irrigation, there's also always a debate sometimes when it comes to discussion around the budget, because it's a huge budget and you don't see the return before 5, 6, 7 years. So it's something, it is an investment in quite a long time period, especially for a country with limited means like us. But it's something that we make sure to have every year in the budget, because we are really too much dependent on weather conditions in terms of agriculture production. And there's an impact on welfare of people, and it has an impact of on the overall GDP too.
Great, thanks, Thierry. Interesting to hear some of your different policies and kind of spending, you know, some on, yeah, as you said, kind of big infrastructure projects and big companies, and some on, I guess, the smallest type of company, which is the individual entrepreneur and these real kind of micro enterprises. So that's interesting to hear. Thank you so much for your insights, Thierry. Okay, now I'd like to bring in Benedict. So perhaps you can help with that. Benedict is the Chief Executive Officer of the Environmental Investment Fund of Namibia. He has 20 years experience in the area of environmental fiscal reforms, climate change financing, environmental and social governance, capital raising and investment structuring. He serves on several international and environmental climate change bodies. He's held strategic positions in biodiversity conservation and environmental climate financing, and was previously employed as National Programme Manager for the United Nations Development Programme. He's got a diploma in marketing, bachelor's degree in tourism management, master's degree in development studies from University of the Free State, South Africa, and MBA from the University of Leicester, in England. So background in many different sectors that we've discussed so far. So Benedict, I hope you can hear me and speak, but more importantly to the audience. Can you tell us a little bit about the Namibia's Environmental Investment Fund, and specifically how how you're kind of raising government revenues from levies and how it came about?
Thank you very much, Phil, Will, and thank you for inviting me to this very important webinar. I feel very honored to be part of this vibrant, Namibia is a developing country in Southern Africa. Small in population, we are about 2.4 million, and we are the second least populated country behind Mongolia. Country covers about 825,000 square kilometers for 2.4 million people. About 90% of the country is semi-arid to hyper-arid, and only 8% of the country is suitable for crop production. We are the driest country in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of recurring droughts. Our first drought strategy as a country was in 1936. So you can just imagine, the harshness of the country in terms of topography and from the climate, perspective. But the challenges of land productivity in our country has been compounded by climate change, where we now experience prolonged droughts and prolonged episodes of environmental nature. And the country received independence in 1990, and prior to independence, there was a lot of unsustainable practices in natural resource management in the country. So there was a lot of overutilization of natural resource, and thereafter, when the new government took over, it realized that a lot of investment should be directed towards environmental sustainability. But at the same time, as a new nation, there were a lot of competing priorities. So it was extremely difficult to capitalize and direct resources towards environmental sustainability. And that's where the Environmental Investment Fund was established to mobilize domestic resources that is channeled towards investment that supports sustainable development, specifically environmental sustainability and ecosystem integrity. So in 2001, the Environmental Investment Fund was established, but it was still a challenge to capitalize the fund. The operations only started in 2012, almost 11 years after promulgated by the government. This again goes to the challenge the nation faced of competing priorities, in developing the nation. So once we started our operation in 2012, we prioritized mobilizing capital from the domestic resources. So we worked with the Ministry of Finance, Customs and Excise, where we undertook a number of feasibility studies related to environmental fiscal reforms for the country. So we identified about 5 areas where we could introduce environmental taxes. One was in the transportation sector, mainly for carbon emission. So currently we are charging a percentage fee on each new vehicle that is being bought in the country. And from the pollution perspective, we've got environmental taxes on batteries, on plastic bags, on tire incandescent bulbs, as well as lubricant oil. So altogether, we've got 6 products that are being imposed for environmental taxation. Customs and Excise in the Ministry of Finance is responsible for the collections of the taxes and then remits the collection to the Environmental Investment Fund. I have to say again, as a developing country, the country has a fiscal consolidation policy towards taxation. So not all the collection is ring-fenced for the Environmental Investment Fund, but 30% of the collection is ring-fenced. And we are now negotiating with the Ministry of Finance to have at least 60% of the collection. Currently, it represents between 4.8 to 5.2 million US dollars per year in terms of collection. So what we do is we've taken a stand and made a deliberate decision that every collection that we receive as a fund should be used to leverage additional resources from international venues, as well as used to inform and create awareness for the private sector on climate investment opportunities. And I'll go in details in a minute. So all in one, we've got a very good ratio when it comes to domestic revenue vis-a-vis international revenue. Our ratio is $1 to 28 Namibian dollars. So one Namibian dollars that is spent by government on the Environmental Investment Fund attracts about 28 Namibian dollars, and that's a huge ratio. We use such, yeah, okay, go ahead. Will?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I was just going to say, yeah, we spoke briefly last week, and this was a really incredible ratio that I'm sure audience and also your fellow panelists will be quite envious about. And maybe can you give us a bit of insight into how you use the budget of the EIF now that you've capitalized it through these levies, what the kind of types of activities you do to leverage this other finance?
Great, yeah. The domestic collection, we use that to cover our overheads. That's extremely important. And then we use some of it for project preparation. So we've got a project preparation facility that we've put in place. And we have been fortunate that we were one of the first entities to be accredited by the Green Climate Fund. I think we're the 19th entity to be accredited by the Green Climate Fund. So much of our revenue also comes from the Green Climate Fund. And recently, we've started the accreditation process to the Adaptation Fund, etc. So we use such proceeds to develop business plans, to undertake feasibility studies, as well as road shows to attract, international capital to the EIF. And we work with a diverse group of partners in mobilizing such resources. So we work with multilateral parties such as the JEF through their UN accredited agencies. We work with the Adaptation Fund. We work with the Green Climate Fund from a multilateralism point of view. From the bilateral relationship, we work with international institutions that have got some sort of cooperative cooperation with the Namibian government, mainly the GIZ, KFW, the Korean Environmental Institute of Technology and Industry, and so forth. Yeah. And then we work with development finance institutions, such as the Development Bank of Southern Africa, the African Development Bank, the French development agencies, etc. With all these entities, we target portfolios that range from sinking funds, which are mostly grants, and then on lending and revolving facilities for the private sector. So, and that has enabled us to diversify the number of financial products that we offer on the market. Grants are mainly used to finance adaptation, mainly for the most vulnerable communities that are reliant on natural resources, mainly small-scale farmers, livestock farmers, etc. And for revolving facilities and on lending, we do design, line of credits for the private sector, where one of the line of credit we designed is a 50 million euro for renewable energy investments for the commercial banks. We also expose the non-banking sector towards, climate investments by creating awareness for them. For example, the non-banking sector stock in Namibia stands about 28 billion US dollars, mainly pension funds. And we have managed to direct about 1 billion US dollars of the pension funds towards renewable energy projects in Namibia through our intervention, through providing technical assistance facility to those, to their general partners and unlisted investment entities, etc. So that's the function that the EIF plays with domestic resources that we mobilize.
Thanks, Benedict. At the end of the day, you gave a few examples from things that you've kind of already initiated in the renewable energy space through the EIF. So perhaps you can tell us a bit about some of your kind of future plans in the EIF, or more broadly about kind of how fiscal policy can be put to work to better encourage investment, specifically in adaptation and climate resilience.
Yes, no, we continue to undertake research on the feasibility of fiscal policies, mainly directed towards environmental taxes in the country. But we also acknowledge that the past few years our economy has been contracting; it hasn't been growing, and then this has been compounded by the pandemic last year and ongoing. As currently we are on a lockdown, so every entities in Namibia is working from home because of the pandemic. And as we wish to expand the fiscal reforms towards environmental taxation, we are mindful of the economy that is stressed. Lots of sectors are going through a stressful cycle, and what kind of impacts will those reforms mean in terms of consumer price index, in terms of government efforts to expedite and grow the economy as we recover from COVID-19. So we are trying to find a balanced approach that if we have to introduce a certain level of fiscal reforms, those fiscal reforms could be designed in a way that we tax the beds and we incentivize the goods. So it has to be an incentive-based kind of approach, so that we're not looked by our stakeholders as a normal taxation entity, but an entity that is designing the utilization of taxes to promote economic growth and recovery. So we've got some exciting products that we're designing in that line, where especially in the energy sector, where we would like to incentivize more on renewable energy, on new emerging, technologies such as green hydrogen fuels that we're developing in the country, and where we would like to tax the beds, such as all those, fossil fuel based economies, and then, create jobs at the other hand that are sustainable, that are green, that propels the Namibian economy forward.
Thanks, Benedict. And just one more question for you quickly. I wondered if you had any reflections on Namibia and its market economy and government that you think makes it relatively easier or relatively harder compared to neighbouring countries and other ACP countries to implement fiscal policies for adaptation and for resilient development?
Yes, interesting question. Well, you'll find that by virtue of our environmental nature in the country, our country is harsh already without even the impact of climate change. One of the reports that was analyzed by the University of Cape Town in South Africa has concluded that Namibia has already surpassed the 1.5 degrees target under the Paris Agreement. So because of the already existing harsh conditions, and that already cause for enabling environment that provides different actors and players to participate on the domestic market. Apart from that, we've got a very good, political systems which is stable for outside, partners to participate in terms of, investment opportunity, in terms of, social investment and environmental opportunities. I think that gives us, a bit of an advantage from a national focal point of view. When it comes to Environmental Investment Fund of Namibia, we are such a lean organization, so we are not so stringent. We are so flexible with decision making, so we are able to amend, to change our governance architecture in a way it suits and it speaks to the requirements of different, development partners and donors. So we don't take long to reform if we don't have a specific policy and procedure in place. It won't take, cabinet approvals, etc., etc. It's up to us to redesign it, take it to the board. Within a few days, it's passed, and it's implemented, and that makes us, a very flexible organization. We respond quickly to opportunities that presents themselves.
Thanks so much, Benedict. Yeah, for your contributions, and I'm sure we will also see some case studies or information or around your work and Namibia and the fund in the reports in this series, and certainly some of the things you mentioned are around the kind of broader business enabling environment, are kind of themes that we wrote around on papers and blogs in this series already. So yeah, lots of kind of synergies and stuff there. And also a nice kind of segue onto our last speaker, Roger. You kind of spoke about the kind of inherent kind of priority of managing water and the harshness and dryness of Namibia's kind of ecosystem, and how kind of a lot of your development is always kind of oriented around resilience and adaptation and sustainable management of water resources already, and has been for hundreds of years. So great, brings us on to Roger. Welcome. Roger is an independent consultant, associate of the Overseas Development Institute in London, water policy specialist with over 25 years experience in applied research all across the world. And Roger's also worked for the British Geological Society as a natural resource economist, where he remains an honorary research fellow. Roger is also the only person to also be in the UK with me. So hi Roger. You've got we've had some great examples from three different countries and 3 different contexts, and nice to have you at the end with some experience from many different countries, and also specifically from the water sector. Be great if you could give us a bit of an overview of how fiscal policies have been used to date in the water sector for sustainable development.
Thanks, Will, and good morning or good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining on the webinar. You've actually had some good examples already that touch on water, I think, from Thierry and Benedict. Namibia, of course, famous in water circles for its water reclamation and reuse schemes that have been going on since the 60s. And Thierry touched on the difficulty of dealing with an increasingly vulnerable agricultural sector and what to do with it. But before I go further, probably best, I think, just to kind of frame what I'm going to say by saying a couple of things. Firstly, while people like me do like to talk about a water sector because we like our institutional homes and our disciplinary silos, in practice, it rarely exists because decisions on water and water policy is made across the piece by different ministries and different departments, most obviously agriculture and energy. So it's very rare to find an all-powerful water ministry dealing with all aspects of water policy. The reality is much more fragmented and therefore much more difficult. The second framing point I think I would make is that, climate change, adaptation and resilience arguments are not happening in reality in isolation from everything else that is going on in terms of population growth, demographic change, urbanization, changing diets, pollution, environmental degradation, and so on. Pressures that often don't directly arise from climate change. And it's very easy to find oneself adapting narrowly to one part of the climate agenda and effectively maladapting to some of the other pressures you're having to deal with. So irrigation provides a classic example that we could go on to discuss in a bit more detail. In terms of the general sort of historical landscape here, it's worth pointing out that leaving aside the rather artificial distinctions we get between good development and climate change adaptation that sort of tend to run into the financial arguments, probably the biggest thing you can do to increase resilience is make sure that people have a step up, at least on the first step of that water and sanitation ladder. In other words, they have the basic water and sanitation services they need. Because if you don't, you are reliant on much more vulnerable sources. And as we've seen, of course, over the last 18 months or so, this is also a first line of defense against COVID-19. So clean water sanitation is your first step. I think as Thierry was hinting at, another big argument, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is the need to ramp up investment in developing a kind of minimum platform of hydraulic infrastructure that allows conveyance, distribution and storage as a buffer against climate variability. And we see that happening in hydropower, a lot of hydropower potential. Solar also has its own water implications. The big one, agriculture, because rain-fed agriculture is inherently vulnerable, will become more volatile. Therefore, irrigation gives you some buffering to deal with that and to support rural livelihoods. So we're seeing, an increasing amount of investment in the big infrastructure. The private sector focus if I can introduce it now, has shifted a little bit away from utility operations more towards partnership arrangements with government and so-called water stewardship initiatives that are coming from private corporates, also civil society, where we see companies increasingly wanting to deal with water-related risks in their supply operations. One thinks of the food and beverage sector. And finally, just in terms of a kind of general landscape, perhaps a resurgent interest in the sort of economics of water and the role of water pricing, but also, as Charlene was mentioning earlier on, in some of the taxes and subsidies. Pricing is a tricky one. We could talk about that later. There is, the economist's dream of perfect economic pricing that in practical terms is almost impossible to do, but pricing for cost recovery, maintenance, rehabilitation is a huge challenge as the infrastructure stock goes up. And the second thing there would be, to try and avoid some of the pernicious impacts of subsidizing, for example, the wrong types of crop that have big environmental footprints in the wrong areas. So that's, those indirect impacts also important.
Thanks, Roger. Yeah, some great kind of points, framing points, and then also some kind of specific kind of ways that this topic meets the water sector. I want to come back to your point a bit about institutions, and yeah, I'm interested in kind of how does this play out at different levels of government, for example, as well as the urban and rural context. We know kind of a lot of water control is really local, but then a lot of these things like taxes and pricing are being kind of determined nationally. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, different levels of government, also different branches of government. To go back to the first point I made, that there rarely being a kind of Leviathan institution at the, an apex institution dealing with all aspects of water policy. That tends not to happen. So one ends up with a sort of hodgepodge of uncoordinated policies arising from different parts, and the challenge is to try and coordinate and get a bit more of a holistic view on what's going on. I mean, let's pick up on the agriculture point, because for a lot of poorer countries with rain-fed agriculture, this is a key issue. And at a very high level, there's a basic decision here, I guess, about whether you're going to try and grow your own food or whether you're going to import it. Lots of water scarce countries get round the problem of having to mobilize a lot of water for agriculture by importing food and therefore the water embedded in it. I mean, we see that happening across the Middle East and North Africa, so-called virtual water import. So there are those basic questions about what it is you're trying to do with the agricultural sector, and the risk of supporting, for example, irrigation or subsidizing the wrong crops, sugarcane, wheat, whatever it is, fodder, in environments where that simply is not a long-term strategy, or worse, could compromise water uses that are higher up your hierarchy of needs, usually defined in a water law. So, top of the hierarchy would be domestic needs, meeting people's, essential requirements, which is usually a pretty small chunk of the overall water budget. The reason I mention agriculture is because that is usually the big water user, the big withdrawer, but also the big consumer of water. So agricultural policy generally has a huge impact on water conditions and water trajectories. Another aspect of a slightly different aspect of this sort of different levels of government or different branches of government would be that decentralization policies, whether they're political or administrative, often don't go hand in hand with the devolution of financial resources. So lower levels of government being asked to do things that frankly they can't, because the money they have doesn't match with their new set of tasks. And we see that in a lot of countries with local government charged with managing or rehabilitation of systems or managing local catchments, but without really the money to do it. So decentralization, yes, in theory. In practice, a lot depends on how it's done. Another big challenge that is going to be facing a lot of governments is urbanization. And while you know, it's the mega cities that tend to attract a lot of attention here, it's worth pointing out that most of the population growth we're seeing is small towns and cities of less than 1 million people. And these are kind of caught in a grey area between, you know, they may have started out as small communities, but their community-based management of water is no longer fit for purpose. At the same time, they don't have the resources, the manpower, the skills that a larger utility would have in Addis Ababa or Windhoek or Cape Town or wherever. So for those towns and cities, real problems dealing with this sort of growing gap between demand for services and the ability to supply them. So yeah, and that will introduce also a lot of interesting questions around the role of the private sector. Although the arguments around big corporates doing utility management have largely gone, left aside in the 1990s, that demand supply gap we see emerging in small towns and cities inevitably, I think, will be filled by small scale private sector operators operating off-grid, but in need of regulation and quality checks.
Thanks, Roger, and yeah, great kind of tie up and circle back to some kind of reforms or activities that governments can do in order to address that gap and build the business environment and strengthen the private sector in that regards. One last question for you, and apologise to the audience, we've run a little bit over time already, but yeah, just kind of getting right towards the end. But one last question for Roger. I think all three previous panelists spoke of the somewhat kind of limited fiscal space and kind of but budgetary issues facing those countries. So I'm interested to hear from you about where you see opportunities and challenges for using fiscal policy, particularly, you know, in the water sector, obviously, for to improve climate change resilience, recognizing that, you know, some of these things like you know, pricing or you know, taxation might, you know, have challenges and also kind of face some kind of, you know, yeah, implementation challenges in the kind of, given the economic cycle of many of these countries post-COVID.
Well, I mean, a lot of investment needs. I'll mention one before I talk about how to find the money to pay for it, and that is, you know, your basic water resource assessment and monitoring, including early warning and response, actually, that you need for a whole bunch of things, you know, climate adaptation and resilience included, and those. You know, the state of monitoring and assessment is pretty poor in a lot of countries. I mean, we've still got a hell of a long way to go in this one, to be frank. In terms of revenue raising, I mean, the big issue is cost recovery, whether for utilities or for irrigation agencies. I say that because pricing for demand management in utilities or agricultural systems is extremely difficult politically, yes, but also logistically, because as soon as you want to price for demand management, you have to have volumetrically controllable supplies to individual users. So for agriculture, the big water user, well, most agricultural systems weren't designed and built to deliver that. So cost recovery, long-term cost recovery, is what you're aiming for, and often the best you can hope for. I think we'll see a resurgent and a growing amount of interest in nature-based solutions, not just for water conservation and environmental protection, but for big things like flood protection. Now, how those are financed is a tricky one. There will be some interest in so-called payment for ecosystem services schemes that offer at least the opportunity to be sort of self-financing, downstream power, paying upstream farmers for conservation agriculture to reduce sediment loads. But there's still an awful lot of connecting easily identifiable end users with easily identifiable people who are going to take these actions is a big challenge in a lot of watersheds, but certainly one to watch.
Great, thanks, Roger. And that's actually kind of one of my own main areas of interest and kind of work at the moment. Great. So yeah, thanks, Roger. I think that kind of wraps up my specific questions for you. I want to give the floor to all the panelists in case you have questions for each other. So I don't know, Roger or Benedict, Thierry, Nadia, if you had kind of a question or a point of feedback for each other, then please go ahead. Otherwise, attendees, there's a few minutes still to put in questions. And then after that, I'll hand over to Charlene to wrap up. So over to you all, if there's anything to follow up on.
Yeah. Hi, Will.
Please, Nadia,
thanks for this opportunity. So I spoke extensively, but unfortunately, I never even touched the water issue, which is a sore point for us here in Antigua and Barbuda. We've been receiving persistent droughts for the last 5 years or so. And most of our water is generated from reverse osmosis. It's quite expensive. So I was really hoping to learn from Roger about how we can finance it, because so far we've had to finance it through debt. And we're still trying to see how we could do it in a way that's more adaptation friendly, more mitigation friendly. So for example, trying to support the generation not through diesel power generated energy, but through renewable energy. Is there a renewable energy source that could help us to better enable us to get our reverse osmosis plants running? That's one. And secondly, on the water issue, we have been grappling with our catastrophic risk insurance facilities, as you know, as a parametric insurance, to see how we could get some type of insurance protection for droughts. So currently, they do provide protection for excessive rainfall, which we have, because once in a while you'll get this shower and there's flooding, and then the country's in drought right after that. But there's no protection for drought currently, and they're trying actively to research how that could be done. So those are my 2 points. I'm really anxious to hear from you, Roger, on financing that RO plant more effectively. Thank you.
Yes,
please go ahead, Roger.
Well, very, very quickly, I'm just depending on whether you wanted to harvest a few questions before responding. Yeah, great question. Desalination, costs are coming down, but a lot is going to depend on where your energy to power the process is coming from, I guess. I mean, I would kind of flip the question around and say, well, scarcity issues are dealt with partly on the supply side, but what about the demand side? Because a lot of small island states with scarce water are really powering ahead, looking at the demand management side in terms of water harvesting, rooftop capture, reuse, and taking a very hard look at what kinds of activities they want in their countries. Is it really sensible to have lots of irrigated golf courses, or to be exporting fruit, or the kinds of things I spoke to earlier about being careful on the demand side. Drought insurance might be I'd kind of flip that back. I'd be interested to know what happens in Namibia and Rwanda and some of the other countries.
Thanks, Nadia. Roger. Okay, maybe I'm not sure if Benedict is still with us actually. Has a reply to Roger's question back on drought insurance, or any other comments or questions for each other?
I appreciate that wasn't a nice, neat answer to your to the question, and I confess I'm not an expert on desalination, but yeah, I think basically you're stuck with the fact that desalination is costly, and if you look at the sort of from an economic angle, you may generate more water at lower cost by looking at the demand side rather than the supply side. Easier said than done, I appreciate.
I know. Thanks, Roger. We have been looking at the demand side. So there's a lot of suppressed water in our country. So people have learned to do a lot of recycling of water, particularly for landscaping. And our golf courses are mostly dry, except when there's a lot of rain, or if they can get access to some of that recycled water. So we have been doing a lot on the demand side.
Yeah.
If you live in a drought-ridden country, you learn to deal with not having water to do a lot of things. But I think this is just a point for research. So probably Charlene can add this to her list about how we go about financing it more economically.
Thanks, Nadia. It's been, personally, it's been kind of interesting to speak with you all today, and also in the kind of short talks we had before, and really here on this topic, and the kind of interconnectedness of these different sectors, and kind of Roger talked about it kind of explicitly, but really a lot of interconnectedness between how policy objectives regarding climate adaptation might be met through other sectors or areas such as social protection or agriculture or water, but also of course the interconnectedness between those, and the kind of it's not possible to necessarily kind of target a fiscal policy kind of for climate adaptation, and it's kind of that impact is generated through work through these other more kind of I don't know, real economic sectors perhaps. Okay, unless there's anything else, I think over to Charlene to wrap up.
Thanks a lot. I don't have a lot to add. The panel was fantastic, and Will, you've done a bit of a summary too. I mean, I guess the only thing I would say is that we know the climate has changed since, a lot of policies were designed, and we also are in a really good period where there is this growing understanding of climate risks, and financial actors are really kind of taking note of these. Adaptation really is local, and so is resilience. And I think one of the challenges here is trying to find out really the local context in which fiscal policy could be put into place, the local challenges and the local kind of information and risks that climate change poses. It feels like here this is the start of a conversation around fiscal policy for adaptation, but of course all of our panelists are kind of much further ahead in the thinking that they've done in country, and maybe what we need to do is really capitalize on the thinking that's already been done and actually start understanding where that can be replicated or scaled up, or where else the gaps might lie. Better understanding the risks, what's the sector, when is that risk going to occur, who is going to be most impacted by it, and also better understanding of the challenges. I mean, there was a great question that came in around how do we get it down to kind of the informal economy, the local and the subnational structures that Roger mentioned was difficult. when it comes to the subnatural governance structures. Yeah, so really the start of a conversation. What we really need to do as we go through this conversation, as we go through this research, is monitor and make sure we are seeing that adaptation impact. And it was so great to hear from Nadia that Antigua and Barbuda have been really starting to monitor the revenues and the expenditures as they relate to adaptation, because there are limits on public budgets, and we have to be really, really sure that if we're going to make these adjustments, it is benefiting resilience and it is not kind of impacting on the poorest and those that are the most vulnerable anyway. And we are delivering a socially just and equitable transition as well. But thank you very much. I look forward to really exploring this in more detail.
Thanks, Charlene. And yes, and on that note of starting conversations, we come back to the ICR facility, our kind of hosts today. And if you've been inspired or just have kind of questions around how the ICR facility could support you on these topics or related topics, climate adaptation, social protection, water, sustainable development, fiscal policy, how you create a enabling environment for businesses and enterprises to develop and support these societal objectives of yours, either through fiscal policy or some of the other kind of mechanisms and activities that I put up a slide on earlier. Get in touch with us. This is what the facility is here for. There's a large and generous technical assistance facility to support you with that. You can kind of set up these one-on-one clinics, the details of which you can see on your slide, and that's kind of like a meeting and a getting to know each other session with the facility, perhaps with some other experts in the field or the sector, and to kind of co-design a package of a potential package of technical assistance to your organization. So there's information on kind of who exactly is eligible on the website, but you can see an email address below also to get in touch with the facilities team. And yes, we really kind of hope this is the beginning of a conversation with yourselves, the audience, also our panelists, who I hope also kind of see opportunity to collaborate on this and potentially other topics. So yeah, I guess lastly, I'd like to thank our panelists for their time, kind of preparing, and also for the online event itself. Charlene, for the work and the research and pulling it together. Also the ICR facility team, SOC in the background, managing everything. It's been great. If you could do us a great favor and answer the question, that'd be super helpful. And otherwise, we look forward to engage with you on LinkedIn, through our website, other social media. Please pass on that email address to your colleagues and contacts and information about the facility to anyone who might be interested to access it. Thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of your days and your weeks. I am off to my son's 3rd birthday party, and yeah, thank you.